In this Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree video, I'm going to be showing you my Night Blade build. This is a build that's made for the very beginning of the DLC, and you can use through the base game all the way through the DLC using the new weapon type, Backhand Blade, and the weapon itself, Backhand Blade, which is obviously named after the category. And one of the things that I really love about this weapon is that you can acquire it very early on in the DLC. We're talking like you walk in, grab the first Sight of Grace, ride 30 seconds, pick it up. Like, that's literally how fast you can get this weapon. You can upgrade it and then start using it immediately. And this weapon is a fantastic dexterity weapon. At max upgrade, it has S scaling and dexterity, allowing you to really get a lot of damage out of this weapon if you go the dexterity route, which is what I've done here. I've essentially set the Ash of War on this to the one that it has by default, Blind Spot, but I've set it to the Keen Infusion. And what I really love about Backhand Blade is that it's a paired weapon, so you only have to equip one of them, and the weight is 2. This is almost nothing. So if you theoretically wanted to go for like a light build using the Blue Dancer Charm, which is something that I experimented with when I was putting this build together, you absolutely could. You'd be very, very lightweight and do really, really good damage. The problem that I find in the DLC specifically is that enemies just hit really, really hard, particularly early on. So I do not recommend going around in very, very light armor at the beginning, or you're going to just absolutely get decimated. And if you go into the base game with it, though, I think you'll be fine. So if you want to play this build through the base game, consider using a very light armor set or hardly any armor at all and using the Blue Dancer Charm. And this weapon has a fantastic moveset. It hits rather rapidly. The running R2 attack I find is great. It hits twice, so 4 hits rather quickly, just like curved swords, with its running like L1 attack when you're dual wielding. I really like that a lot. And the downside, though, is that there is no native status effect buildup on this weapon, unlike some curved swords or daggers or claws, etc. So you kind of have to go the blood infusion or cold infusion if you want to get something like that. And if you're going blood infusion, you're going to have lower damage and you don't get that S scaling and dexterity. So you kind of have to decide whether that bleeding is worth it to you or whether you want to stick with damage overall. And I decided here to stick with damage overall, and I think it's probably pretty good in terms of early on in the DLC. There's a lot of bleed immune enemies at the very beginning of the DLC. It's not to say that bleeding isn't good. It's good particularly against a lot of bosses, but just regular enemies, because some of them are like shades and some of the more difficult enemies don't actually bleed at the beginning. So bleeding plays a much larger role later as you move through the DLC than it does at the very beginning. I also really love the block counter with this weapon. It's not something you're going to use very often. It doesn't have a good guard boost. It's not made really for block countering, but it has a nice like spin attack that I really like. If you're like surrounded by a lot of enemies and you manage to pull off a block counter, you can hit a lot of enemies. And I just like that the weapon in general hits in a large AoEs with its attack chain, allowing you to clear out lots of like smaller enemies at once. And Blind Spot, its Ash of War, is absolutely what makes this weapon, in my opinion. This thing is an absolute monster. It only costs 9 FP, which is not a lot at all, so you don't really have to have any mind. Like, you don't have to have hardly any at all because you just don't go through it that much. And what this allows you to do is kind of like sidestep an attack and then come in from behind and attack. And you can control the direction that you go with your sticks. You can kind of maneuver out of the way. Like if you're, trying to dodge an attack left or right, you can use it to dodge sometimes. And it has iframes to it, which is fantastic. So it allows you to dodge through attacks, hit enemies, and it's really good when, instead of like rolling because you see an attack coming, you can just iframe through it right in the middle of your combo, get positioned to attack again, and then continue attacking. So it's like being able to like sidestep or quick step, but then attack in the same animation, which I really, really like. The problem with this Ash of War, or this weapon skill, though, is it costs a lot of stamina, and I mean a lot of stamina in order to use it. So you really have to have a good amount of stamina in order to use this reliably, because what I find happens is if you use it about twice in combat, if you have just an average amount of stamina, then you're like completely drained of stamina and you're standing there not able to attack, not able to use it, etc. So what I've done with this build is I've given us a lot of stamina, and I've also equipped a talisman for stamina recovery in order to get that stamina back more quickly so that you can use this ability more often. If you remember, I made a build using the Bloody Hellas weapon in the base game, and Bloody Hellas weapon has Dynas Finesse on it, and that weapon skill is extremely stamina hungry as well. Like really the limitation to that weapon is stamina, and it's kind of the case here as well. So you have to build for lots of stamina, or you really can't use this weapon skill all that effectively. And to get more stamina recovery, you could put the turtle shield in your offhand and just put it on your back, because when you two-hand this weapon, you're dual wielding it because it's a paired weapon anyway. That would give you some stamina recovery. I don't really like the fashion, but you absolutely could do that. You could put Sacrificial Axe on here in order to give you FP back when you get kills as well, because you're not really using it. That could also help with your FP management, even though it's not really a problem with this build. There's a lot of other weapons you could put in your offhand that just, are there for effect, so you might want to consider doing that as well. However, if you decide to go the blue dancer charm route, like through the base game, I wouldn't recommend doing that. So armor-wise, I have the Black Knight set. You can get this from farming Black Knights. It'll take you a little while to do. You don't have to use this set, but I really like the style with the blades. It kind of has this, cool fashion to it. I really love some of the new armor sets. They look awesome in my opinion. But this thing gives you good protection, has decent poise at 60, and frankly, enemies hit really, really hard. And this is a build that's trying to avoid damage by iframing through attacks. But when you're still learning to play it, using a heavier armor set to protect yourself is not a bad idea. And I feel like as you get better and more proficient with the weapon skill and learn enemies' attack patterns a bit more and make your way through the DLC, you can probably go down to light armor just like you would in the base game, but probably not at the beginning when you're learning it in enemy attack patterns. And actually, if you're trying to play like a heavy armor build, we have room with, our equip load in order to go with an even more protective set if you want. So if you're min-maxing, you would absolutely do that. But in this case, I was prioritizing fashion, which I often do because I wanted to showcase a new armor set. But you might want to use something with even more protection because you got plenty of equip load there in order to do that. So talismans-wise, I have Millicent's Prosthesis and Rottenwing Sword Insignia for stacking up attack power with rapid attacks. Again, you probably won't have both these. You'll probably have to use Winged Sword Insignia, Millicent's Prosthesis, or Rottenwing Sword Insignia, and maybe like Shard of Alexander. I find that the Blind Spot skill itself doesn't do a ton of damage. It's not bad. It can often one-shot regular enemies, but it's not your bread and butter in terms of damage. Like attacking rapidly, stacking up buffs is how you get most of your damage on hard-to-kill enemies and bosses. So you can kind of juggle those around depending on what you have and what you like. I also really like the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman. I'm probably going to have it on most of my early DLC builds because, frankly, you just get hit like a truck in the DLC, and this will help keep you alive. But again, in this build, one of your strategies here is to learn not to get hit. So once you find yourself getting more proficient, like out on the landscape with this skill and enemies, you might want to consider swapping that out for something that increases your attack power, like Ritual Sword Talisman if you find you're not getting hit, or maybe one of the new talismans like the Crusade Talisman that increases your damage after you kill an enemy for some time. That's also not a bad one to use. So then the newcomer here is the Two-Headed Turtle Talisman. This increases your stamina recovery speed even more than the regular Turtle Talisman. Highly recommend this for a lot of builds, particularly if you're running the Turtle Talisman before. But you can find this in a cave that's kind of like, it's a ways into the DLC in terms of like riding distance, but you really don't have to kill anything to go get it. You can literally just ride through a lot of enemies to get it. We'll show the location of it here. You don't have to go get it right away, but eventually you'll probably want to add it. You can use the regular Turtle Talisman until you get it. So attribute-wise for this build, I have 50 Vigor. This is pretty standard for this point. You aren't going to want to go lower than this because you will make mistakes, and frankly, enemies do hit very hard, so don't go lower than that. We got 20 Mind here. You don't need a lot of FP for this build, frankly. You could probably get away with 15 even if you use more blue flasks than what I have. Mind is just not a huge priority for this build because you don't use a lot. 9 FP is not expensive at all. Endurance is at 38 because I simply dumped like all my excess points into Endurance in order to gain more stamina. Probably don't need to take Endurance higher than 40. I don't think I would go higher than 40, but somewhere between 30 and 40 is ideal because you will see that you consume lots of stamina using this build. This will actually, allow you to use a heavier armor set if you want, but that's not really what you need for this build. It's really for the stamina, and if you don't have a good amount of stamina, you're going to have problems with this weapon playstyle. Strength is at 10 to meet the minimum requirements for the weapon. I have 85 dexterity here. This should be 80. I mean, you can put more in it. Obviously, it's S scaling, but I have 5 from Millicent's Prosthesis. I was at 80 before, so you could probably drop this down 5 points and put more into Vigor, or you could put them in a couple into Endurance, a couple into Mind, etc., in order to kind of be a little bit more optimal. You don't need any Intelligence, Faith, or Arcane. I have 16 Intelligence since I was an Astrologer, so those don't really play a factor in this build. So then when it comes to Flask of Wondrous Physique, I have the Greenburst Crystal tier to give me stamina recovery speed, just because I love having more stamina for this build. More stamina is better. You don't want to ever have to slow down and wait because of stamina. And we also have the Thorny Cracked here in order to further boost our damage when we hit rapidly, which is kind of the theme of this build. And when it comes to Great Runes, Radahn's is probably the best choice here because it gives you health, FP, and stamina. And really what you want is that stamina, but FP is good. You know, you don't have a lot of mine, so having some extra is not bad. And then, of course, health will help protect you in case you make mistakes, which happens all the time when learning bosses in the DLC. They are particularly hard. So that gives you, plenty of wiggle room there. So that wraps up my Nightblade build. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I really love this weapon. I think it's arguably my favorite so far of the early game weapons. I haven't tested out every weapon in the DLC, obviously, at this point. And there are some fantastic weapons in the DLC, but this one, I mean, you can get within 30 seconds of entering the DLC, and it's a banger. So I hope you really enjoy this one. And as always, if you have questions or further tips with this weapon, please leave them in the comments, and I will try and respond to them as quickly as I can.